Chapter 1. The sacred silence shattered. A white police officer dared to pull a gun on a black general at a hero's funeral, spitting on the graves of America's fallen with his hatred. In broad daylight, with children watching and veterans weeping, he turned a moment of mourning into a battlefield of bigotry. The audacity of his prejudice wasn't just a crime, it was a betrayal of everything those headstones stood for. On a crisp autumn morning in 2025, Evergreen Memorial Cemetery lay cloaked in solemn stillness, its endless rows of white marble markers stretching beneath a sky heavy with gray clouds. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth and fading flowers, a quiet tribute to the soldiers resting beneath the soil. Here, among the heroes of wars past, Lieutenant General Evelyn Carter stood at a podium, her decorated uniform gleaming faintly in the muted light. At 55, Evelyn was a living testament to resilience, a black woman who had climbed to one of the highest ranks in the U.S. Army through 28 years of grit and sacrifice. Her Silver Star from Iraq and Bronze Star from Somalia hung proudly on her chest, each medal a story of courage under fire. Today, she wasn't leading troops but honoring one, Colonel Daniel Grayson, her mentor and friend, whose flag-draped casket rested nearby. The crowd, military families, veterans, and civilians, listened in reverent silence as her steady voice painted a picture of Grayson's life. A man who'd served with distinction for 25 years until his heart gave out peacefully months prior. The brass buttons on Evelyn's uniform caught the weak sunlight filtering through the overcast sky, a subtle gleam against the dark fabric. Her silver-streaked hair, pulled taut in a bun, framed a face etched with both sorrow and strength. She'd broken barriers to stand here, one of the highest-ranking black women in military history. Yet not everyone saw her as worthy. Off to the side, a cluster of older white veterans murmured among themselves, their whispers barely audible but cutting all the same. "She only got that rank because of politics," one muttered, his voice laced with the quiet venom of assumption, a microaggression Evelyn had heard in countless forms over the decades. She pressed on, her words a shield against their doubt, her focus unwavering on Grayson's legacy. The mourners stood in a sea of dress uniforms and black attire, their professional bearing masking the grief tugging at their features. A child clutched her mother's hand near the front, eyes wide with the weight of the moment. Veterans, some leaning on canes, others ramrod straight despite their years, dotted the crowd, their presence a living link to the sacrifices buried here. No one expected the peace to fracture, not here, not now. But as Evelyn's voice carried across the hallowed ground, a ripple of movement broke the stillness, a dark figure pushing through the crowd with a purpose that felt all wrong. Chapter 2. The Barrel of Hate. Officer David Hargrove didn't belong here. His black jacket stood out like a stain against the formal military attire, his heavy boots scuffing the grass as he shoved past grieving families with no regard for their tears. 17 years with the local police force had hardened him, but beneath his badge simmered a resentment that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the color of Evelyn's skin. He stopped a dozen feet from the podium, his face twisted with an anger that radiated like heat off pavement. "You don't belong leading this," he snarled, his voice slicing through Evelyn's eulogy like a jagged blade. The crowd recoiled, a collective gasp rippling outward as parents pulled children close and veterans tensed, hands twitching toward holsters they didn't carry. Evelyn didn't flinch. She'd faced enemy fire in Baghdad, led night raids in Somalia, and stared down doubters who claimed her stars were handed to her because of quotas. This wasn't her first battlefield, and it wouldn't be her last. Her posture remained straight, her brown eyes locking onto Hargrove's with a calm that belied the chaos unfolding. "Officer, lower your weapon," she commanded, her voice cutting through the tension with the authority of a general who'd earned every stripe. But Hargrove didn't listen. His service pistol, meant to protect, now pointed directly at her chest, his knuckles whitening around the grip. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air, and his hand trembled just enough to betray a flicker of doubt. The gunshot hadn't come yet, but time seemed to freeze in that moment. A mother near the front muffled a sob, clutching her son behind a headstone. An elderly veteran, his medals clinking faintly, muttered a curse under his breath, his instincts screaming to act though his body couldn't. The honor guard near Grayson's casket stood rigid, their ceremonial rifles useless against this threat, their knuckles pale with restraint. Hargrove's eyes burned with a gleam Evelyn had seen before, not in combat zones, but in the quiet sneers of those who'd questioned her right to lead. "Affirmative action, General," he spat, the words low but venomous. A dog whistle to the biases that had dogged her career from the start. Across the crowd, Sergeant Jamal Tate, a 29-year-old Marine with 2 tours in Syria, watched the scene unfold with a predator's focus. His lean frame, clad in dress blues, tensed as he clocked the tremor in Hargrove's gun hand, a split-second waver that spoke of uncertainty. Jamal had seen that look in insurgents' eyes before they broke, and he knew the window it offered. 3 years of combat training kicked in, his body moving before his mind fully caught up. In one fluid motion, he lunged forward, hands locking around Hargrove's wrist and forcing the barrel skyward just as the trigger snapped. The gunshot roared across Evergreen, a violent crack that sent birds scattering from the trees and shattered the sanctity of the place. The bullet tore harmlessly into the clouds, but the sound lingered, an echo of hate intruding on a space meant for peace. Jamal didn't stop. He twisted Hargrove's arm with practiced precision, driving him to his knees as the pistol clattered to the grass. 2 other soldiers, a captain and a lieutenant, rushed forward. Their movements synchronized like a unit in drill. They pinned Hargrove face down, his cheek pressed into the damp earth as he thrashed. "She doesn't belong here," he shouted, his voice raw with exertion and rage, spittle flecking the ground. "This is ours." The words laid bare the ugly truth behind his actions, a prejudice so deep it had festered into violence. A civilian woman nearby, her phone trembling as she recorded, whispered to her friend, she should have known better than to provoke him, her tone shifting blame onto Evelyn, a subtle, insidious reflex that stung as much as Hargrove's slurs. Evelyn stood unwavering at the podium, her gaze steady as the chaos settled. She'd faced worse than this. Back in '98, a white colonel had muttered about diversity hires at her first promotion. His voice low but loud enough to carry. She'd buried the hurt then, just as she did now, and turned back to her task. Colonel Grayson deserved his tribute, and she wouldn't let hate steal that from him. Daniel Grayson gave his life to this country, she continued, her voice rising over Hargrove's fading shouts. And no coward's bullet will silence his legacy. The crowd stilled, her resolve a beacon in the storm, as Evergreen's peace began to mend around her words. Chapter 3. Immediate Aftermath. The echo of the gunshot still hung in the air as Sergeant Jamal Tate tightened his grip on David Hargrove's wrists, pressing the officer's chest into the wet grass. Hargrove's shouts grew hoarse, his face red with exertion as he spat. "She doesn't belong here. This is ours." The words clawed at the silence, revealing a hatred so raw it seemed to stain the very ground of Evergreen Memorial. The 2 soldiers pinning him, a captain with a scarred jaw and a lieutenant with steady hands, worked in tandem, their knees digging into Hargrove's back until his thrashing stilled. The pistol lay a few feet away, its black metal glinting dully in the grass, secured moments later by a quick-thinking private who slid it into an evidence bag with a gloved hand. Around them, the crowd remained frozen, a tableau of shock and grief. A child whimpered behind a headstone, her mother's arms a frail shield against the violence that had intruded on their mourning. Veterans clenched their fists, their eyes flickering with the muscle memory of combat, though their ceremonial uniforms offered no weapons to wield. The honor guard near Colonel Grayson's casket stood like statues, their faces taut with discipline, but their gazes betrayed a fury they couldn't voice. In the midst of it all, Lieutenant General Evelyn Carter returned to the podium, her boots clicking softly against the platform. Her uniform, pristine despite the chaos, seemed to anchor the scene, a symbol of order against Hargrove's disorder. Evelyn's voice rose again, steady and unshaken, as she resumed the eulogy. "Colonel Grayson lived for duty," she said, her words carrying a weight that silenced the last of Hargrove's mutterings. "He taught us that true strength lies in standing for what's right, no matter the cost." Her composure was a quiet defiance, a refusal to let hate derail the tribute Grayson deserved. The crowd leaned into her words, finding solace in their rhythm, though the tension lingered like smoke after a fire. She spoke of Grayson's leadership in Kosovo, his mentorship in her early years, and the quiet dignity of his final days, each sentence a brick rebuilding the sanctity Hargrove had tried to shatter. Not everyone saw her strength. A white civilian woman, still clutching her phone as the video rolled, leaned toward her friend, her voice a hushed murmur. She should have known better than to provoke him, standing up there like she owns the place. The words were soft but sharp, a subtle twist of blame that pinned the incident on Evelyn rather than the man who'd drawn the gun. It was a reflex Evelyn knew well, decades of being told her presence, her success, was an affront to someone else's comfort. She'd heard it in the barracks, in boardrooms, in the sidelong glances of those who assumed her rank was a gift rather than a fight. She let it slide off her now, her focus locked on the casket and the man it held. As police sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer to Evergreen, the soldiers handed Hargrove over to arriving officers. His wrists clicked into cuffs. His head bowed but his jaw still tight with defiance. Evelyn finished her eulogy with a final line. Rest well, Daniel, your legacy stands firm. The crowd exhaled as one. A collective release. And for a moment, the cemetery reclaimed its peace. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing, one that would soon spill far beyond these hallowed grounds. Chapter 4. Investigation and Trial. The investigation into David Hargrove began before the sun set on Evergreen Memorial. By nightfall, his personnel file from the Ashton County Police Department lay open on a detective's desk. Its pages a roadmap of buried sins. 19 complaints of excessive force against minorities spanned his 17-year career. Incidents of black teens roughed up at traffic stops. Latino shopkeepers, accidentally shoved during arrests. All dismissed with vague notes about insufficient evidence. Body camera footage had a habit of malfunctioning in his presence. And internal affairs probes fizzled out under layers of bureaucratic red tape. A whistleblower, a rookie cop named Officer Lena Ortiz, finally broke the silence, her voice trembling as she told investigators. We were told to protect our own. That's what they called it, keeping the family intact. Hargrove's attack wasn't random. He'd chosen the funeral knowing the military personnel would be unarmed, their ceremonial sidearms loaded with blanks. The security footage from Evergreen played on loop in the precinct, frame by frame. It showed his deliberate march through the crowd, his hand steady as he drew his weapon, and the chaos as Jamal Tate intervened. Most damning was his interrogation tape, recorded hours after his arrest. They're taking over everything, he'd said, his voice dripping with contempt as he sat in a gray room. Cuffs clinking against the table. Jobs, ranks, our country, she's just the face of it. People like her don't earn their place. The mask of professional conduct had slipped, and he didn't seem to care that the camera caught every word. 3 weeks later, the federal courthouse in downtown Ashton became a lightning rod. The trial drew national media. The gallery packed daily with military personnel in crisp uniforms, civil rights activists with signs demanding justice, and law enforcement officials shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Evelyn sat near the front, her face a study in calm, though the past month had brought a new barrage of hate. Online, trolls flooded her social media with venom, calling her a diversity hire, a token general, their words a digital echo of the whispers she'd faced for years. One post, liked thousands of times, read, she got lucky that Marine saved her, proof she can't handle real pressure. The attacks stung, but she'd weathered worse, they only sharpened her resolve. Witnesses took the stand one by one. Jamal Tate, his voice steady but charged, recounted Hargrove's intent. I saw it in his eyes, pure hate. Not fear. He wanted to hurt her because of who she was. A black teenager, 16-year-old Malik Jones, testified about a run-in with Hargrove 2 years prior, stopped for looking suspicious, near a gas station. Shoved against a wall with no cause. The complaint buried when his mother filed it. He told me I'd never amount to anything, Malik said, his hands clenched in his lap. The prosecution built its case methodically. Hargrove's history of bias, his pattern of targeting minorities, the system that had shielded him for too long. The courtroom screens flickered with evidence. The Evergreen footage played again. The gunshots echoed, drawing winces from the jury. Hargrove's rant from the interrogation followed, his words a raw confession of prejudice. The prosecution leaned hard on his choice of target, an unarmed black woman honoring a fallen soldier. A moment he'd turned into a stage for his hate. The defense tried to spin it differently, claiming Hargrove suffered from PTSD, that the stress of the job had snapped him. He's a dedicated officer pushed to the edge, his lawyer argued, voice smooth but hollow. Under cross-examination, the facade crumbled. A former colleague, testifying reluctantly, admitted to overhearing Hargrove's racist jabs, comments about those people taking over. Incidents he'd ignored to keep the peace. Outside, the nation watched. Protests flared in cities from Atlanta to Seattle. Chants of "No badge above justice" ringing out. Police departments faced scrutiny. Their "protect our own" mentality cracking under the weight of public outrage. Evelyn, meanwhile, endured the spotlight with quiet dignity, her every move dissected by those who saw her as a symbol, some of hope, others of disruption. The trial stretched over 3 weeks, each day peeling back layers of a system that had let Hargrove fester. By the end, the jury held his fate, and with it, a chance to prove that justice could still prevail. Chapter 5. Verdict and Sentencing. The jury's deliberation lasted just 2 hours, a blink in a case that had gripped the nation for weeks. When they filed back into the federal courthouse in Ashton, the air was thick with anticipation, every seat in the gallery creaking under the weight of held breath. David Hargrove sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped, his face ashen as though he already knew the tide had turned. Lieutenant General Evelyn Carter watched from the front row, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though the faint tremor in her fingers betrayed the stakes of this moment. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, stood and read the verdict. Guilty on all counts: attempted murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, terroristic threats, and hate crime enhancements. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, a wave of relief crashing against the tension that had built for days. Hargrove didn't move as the words sank in, his hands trembling slightly on the table, his lawyer's head bowed, the PTSD defense shredded by the prosecution's relentless evidence, his history, his words, his intent laid bare. The gallery buzzed with whispers, military personnel nodding solemnly, activists clutching each other's hands, a few law enforcement officials staring at the floor. Evelyn's mind flickered back to a memory from '99, her first promotion ceremony, when a white colonel had muttered about quotas loud enough for her to hear. She'd swallowed the insult then, turned it into fuel. Now, as the gavel struck, that same fire burned in her chest, tempered by a quiet victory. Judge Abigail Torres, a woman with 3 decades on the bench, rose to deliver the sentencing. Her voice carried the weight of authority, each syllable deliberate. "Mr. Hargrove," she began, her gaze piercing through him, "you wore a uniform meant to protect and serve. Instead, you used it as armor for your prejudice. You aimed a weapon at a woman who has dedicated her life to this nation's defense, a woman who stood unarmed, honoring a fallen hero. Today, justice removes that armor." The room stilled as she paused, letting the words settle. "For your crimes, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel fell again, a sharp crack that echoed like the gunshot at Evergreen. But this time it signaled an end, not a beginning. The impact was immediate. Outside the courthouse, cheers erupted from the gathered crowd, hundreds strong, their signs aloft. Justice prevails. No hate in uniform. News cameras swarmed, broadcasting Torres's words nationwide. Inside, Evelyn met Jamal Tate's eyes across the room. He gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of their shared stand. Hargrove was led away in cuffs, his head low, his defiance snuffed out. For Evelyn, it wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a crack in the wall that had shielded men like him for too long. She thought of Malik Jones, the teenager who'd testified, and the countless others Hargrove had targeted. This wasn't just her fight, it was theirs. The sentencing marked a turning point. Police departments across the country couldn't ignore the message. The cost of protecting rogue officers had grown too high. The blue wall trembled, its cracks widening under the glare of public scrutiny. Evelyn stepped outside into the autumn air, the weight of the days settling on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle she'd earned. Chapter 6. Ripple Effects and Conclusion. The ripples from Hargrove's sentencing spread far beyond Ashton. Within weeks, police departments from Los Angeles to Boston launched sweeping reviews of their disciplinary procedures. Spurred by a public that refused to look away, the "protect our own" mentality, once an unspoken creed, began to fracture as body camera reforms and civilian oversight boards gained traction. The footage from Evergreen Memorial, Hargrove's drawn weapon, Jamal's swift intervention, Evelyn's unyielding resolve, became a staple in law enforcement training sessions. It wasn't just a warning of what could go wrong, it was proof that justice could hold when good people stood firm. Evelyn returned to Fort Bragg 2 months later, addressing a new class of officer candidates under a crisp winter sky. Her uniform still bore the medals of her past, but her words carried the weight of Evergreen. Power isn't measured by the weapon you carry or the badge you wear, she told them, her voice steady and clear. It's measured by your commitment to serve something greater than yourself. The cadets, a mix of eager faces from every background, hung on her every syllable. Her speech filtered into police academy curricula nationwide, a cornerstone for a generation rethinking what service meant. She didn't mention Hargrove by name, but his shadow loomed, a cautionary tale etched into the lesson. Back at Evergreen Memorial, a small bronze plaque now marked the spot where Evelyn had stood her ground. Its inscription was simple: "Valor stands unbowed." It honored her and Jamal, but also the quiet courage of those who'd borne witness that day. On a quiet Saturday, a young black girl, maybe 10 years old, stood before it, her braids swaying in the breeze as she traced the words with a small finger. Her mother, a nurse who'd watched the trial unfold on TV, smiled softly. "She's like you," the girl said, looking up, strong. Evelyn, visiting Grayson's grave nearby, caught the exchange and felt a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't over. Whispers of unearned success and online venom still lingered, but moments like this were seeds of change. The story didn't end with Hargrove's cell door closing. It lived in the protests that demanded accountability, in the policies rewritten to root out bias, in the girl who saw herself in Evelyn's stand. It was a reminder that real change came from confronting uncomfortable truths, the subtle slights of assumed incompetence, the overt violence of unchecked hate and refusing to let them stand. Evergreen's peace had been broken once, but it had healed stronger, its headstones bearing silent witness to a new legacy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Evelyn turned from Grayson's grave. She'd fought for justice before, and she'd fight again, but for now, she walked away with the quiet certainty that her voice, and the voices of those like her, would echo on. The nation wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was listening. And that was a start.